And welcome to a quarterly zoo update. I'm not going to be able to touch MTGO for a little while because I'm moving to Philadelphia and whatnot. So, as such, you're going to get a little bit less zoo than normal, not once a week generally. And because of that, I decided to go over a zoo update. I decided quarterly is probably the best bet. Some people wanted me to do weeklies, things like that, but I'm not going to do a weekly thing because zoo does not change week to week. It changes at most 4 times a year, and not even the quarter is going to change by that much. It's only going to change if the meta changes. So right now I'm going to talk about what the modern metagame is post Deathrite ban and what it probably is looking like into the future. Okay, so the first thing we want to talk about right away is that zoo is not the best positioned deck in the world. I would say the statistics are a little bit of a lie. You're not seeing a ton of zoo in the top decks, and that doesn't necessarily mean that zoo is not a good deck. It just means in the current meta as it stands, zoo is not the best deck in existence. And what is that meta? Well, zoo is one of those decks that's not like Jund where it has a 50-50 game all the time. It has a very good game against a couple certain types of deck. It has a very normal game against a couple other types of decks, and then it has a very bad matchup against a couple more decks. So the decks that zoo preys on is things like control and tempo. Those are really when zoo's at its best. For example, in Legacy, zoo was a dominating force back when like Stoneforge control and it just came out. And back when Merfolk was like everywhere, that's when zoo's at its tops. Now Merfolk in Legacy is a tempo deck, not a modern deck, which is an aggro deck. Now that being said, the tempo deck in the modern format is Delver, and occasionally Twin. But that's about it when it comes to tempo. You've got different types of Delver, UR Delver, Grixis Delver, American Delver, which is basically evolved into American midrange anyways. You also have things like Rug, Vile Rug, or Eternal Control Rug, which is pretty much a tempo deck. The only real control decks we can say off the top of our head is American Control 100%. That includes different varieties of American Control, so the normal Wafatafa American Control as well as Kiki-Jiki Control, which is a control deck, not a combo deck. It's definitely just using a combo finish as its win condition. It's a control deck. And maybe Esper Gifts, that's about it. So Esper Gifts is strongly a tier 1.5, maybe tier 2, but that's generally those control decks as we think of them, blue-based control decks that zoo could prey on. Zoo, I don't want anyone to make you think that zoo has less than a 50-50 matchup with American Control. It doesn't matter how chock full of removal American Control is, you can outpace them. American Control is a good matchup for you. As long as you don't get greedy and you use your Rampagers correctly and you're not like throwing your Rampagers into creatures that are going to get bolted, you will win. Even with board wipes, you've got a good chance of winning if you're packing things like Boros Charm. My matchup against Control online competitively so far has been about, I would say, 80% me. It's actually that good. Against tempo decks like Delver, I would also then argue and say it's closer to 90% me. That being said, there's a bunch of decks currently on the top tables that is not well positioned against zoo. Splinter Twin actually is not the worst matchup in the world. It's at best and at worst, I would say 50-50. If they get the combo off, you lose. There's no really going around that. But the mid-range version of Twin is actually pretty good, other than a Tarmogoyf, which you can Rampager over or Path to Exile over, so that's 8 cards that you can use against it. And then you've got this Splinter Twin, as long as they don't get something crazy out there, the tempo version, like what do you call it? A batter skull. You've got a very good chance of winning. Again, if they combo off, you lose, but it's like an oops, I win thing. And that's just zoo's bad matchup against combo. You've also got things like Affinity, which is not a bad matchup, but you need to have the removal for it. Basically, you need to, as long as you mulligan any hand that does not have a good removal suite, you are very likely going to win game 2 and 3 because you're siding in way more removal against them. Again, UR Delver is a very, very good tempo deck in the current modern meta, and I would say that you have an 80 to 90% win rate against them. You can out removal them, and while they're dirtling with their card draws, you're powering out creatures and swinging. Mono Red Burn is not good, but if we're talking about the heal Burn archetype or the heal red deck wins archetype, you actually have a very, very good matchup against them. Jund is, I would say, 50-50. It's not the worst thing in the world to play against, but it's also not the best thing in the world again. If they play things like either like a Obliviator, which Phyrexian Obliviator, and if you don't have the path, it's over for you. But if you do have the path, you pretty much win. You've got a better early game than them, and they're not early enough to with Deathrite Shaman anymore that you still have a pretty good matchup against them. But you've got to be wary of how much removal they have, 1-for-1 removal, and if they anger the gods, you've got to choose if you're going to overextend to beat out their 1-for-1 removal, or if you're going to underextend so you don't get killed by anger the gods. But Meloripod is the reasoning that you don't want to play. If you don't want to play Zoo right now, Meloripod is your reasoning. Meloripod is a horrible matchup. If Pod didn't exist, Zoo would definitely be a tier 1 deck. I'm going to actually blatantly say that. If Pod just suddenly got banned tomorrow and the whole deck fell apart, Zoo would be a tier 1 deck. Strongly tier 1. With Meloropod's existence, and it's not necessarily Kitchen Finks, although the second Kitchen Finks will kill you, the first Kitchen Finks will not kill you, you lose. That's just generally how it goes. Pod just has an insurmountable amount of CA. Even Jund, you can outrace them, and if you remove their Tarmogoyf in the late game, or their Dark Confidant, you could probably Trampage over and win the game. Pod, you cannot do that. If you remove a creature, they've already gained some value off of it. For example, Kitchen Finks has gained them life, or any of their creatures is already starting to give them a little bit of value. Not to mention, if they drop a Meloripod, you will lose the game because they will get anything they need to beat you, including Voice of Resurgence or any of their one-ofs. I had a game where I literally went to turn 20, and I only had 3 creatures. I had a Pridemage, which blew up a Pod, a Tarmogoyf who died, and a Kirdape. And everything else I drew was a Path to Exile, or one of my millions. I think I sided in for Chain to the Rocks, 2 Oust, as well as Volcanic Fallout, and I removed all of their creatures completely, with exile effects, mind you. And when they landed, and when I drew a land instead of a removal spell, and they drew a Pod, and then on the next turn drew a Birds of Paradise, which got them into a Voice of Resurgence, which eventually got them into a Kitchen Finks, I lost the game. It was that simple. Pod just gains them so much value, not to mention their entire deck is value. They're very much a mid-range deck now and less of a combo deck, but in a stall they can also mid-range or combo you out. So Pod's the reasoning why I would say Zoo isn't currently at this quarter, mind you, the best deck in the world. Following Pod, you also have things like American Control, Storm, which actually isn't the worst matchup in the world, Scapeshift, which is if you outrun them, you can beat them, same thing with Green-Red Tron, Hate Bears, you actually have a pretty good matchup against because you can Rampage her over and Path to Exile anything they put down, Fairies, which you have a fantastic matchup, and I'm getting a little worse down here, like at 1% we have Tokens, Ad Nauseam, Boggle, Soul Sisters, as well as Zoo, Gifts. But you're looking at, if you look at the biggest decks, you've got Splinter Twin, which I said we have a 50-50 matchup against, Affinity, which we have probably a 50-50 matchup against, at least game 1, game 2 might 60-40. Delver, which we have an awesome matchup against, Mono Red Burn, which we have a bad matchup against, Jund, we have an unfavorable matchup, Meloripod, we have an awful matchup, Blue, White, Red Control, we have a favorable matchup, and Storm, which we have at best a 50-50 matchup if it's unfavorable at worst. So out of those decks, out of those 8 top decks, and those are the ones with 4% and above, we only have a favorable matchup against 2 of those decks. We have an unfavorable matchup against 3 to 4 of those decks, and we have a meh matchup against 2 of those decks. You can see how the statistics aren't leaning in our favor at that point. You would really need Pod to disappear, American Control to become bigger, and then like having things like Scapeshift or even green-white hate bears or something that's good for us, like let's say Gifts coming up, in order for it to be a really, really good, strong tier 1 deck in this meta. Now, that's not to say that the Zoo core is not good. The Zoo core is great. It's perfect. It's just aggro in this meta in general is not necessarily the best meta in the world. And the reason why I would say Affinity is ranked so highly on the modern online meta is because Affinity is so cheap to put together. That's literally the reason why it's up there. It's more to do with the price of Affinity and less to do with how good Affinity is on its own. That's also one of the many reasons why Zoo isn't higher up, is because if you have a Tarmogoyf, what are you going to play, Jund, or are you going to play Zoo? A lot of people will choose Jund because it's better in the current meta, which is fine. You can't doubt them for that. That being said, here are some things and some tips that I've found over playing Zoo very competitively over the last couple months, what have been helping me. As you can see here, I've listed up a bunch of different cards for you to look at. Pridemage, Ooze, Choke, Grafdigger's Cage, Mutagenic Growth, Thalia, Eidolon of the Great Revel, and Gore Clan Rampager. Those are the cards I want to say off the top of my head that can steal wins for you out of those unfavorable matchups. So let's go over them one by one. Qasali Pridemage. One of the reasons why he's on there is he can kill Pod. He can kill Twin. Twin can't combo out with him, and if you have one open mana. I've generally won almost all of my game ones by putting out a Qasali Pridemage and just having it out there. It can also be extra removal against Affinity, which is great. You always want more removal against Affinity since you're a control deck. It's good against weird sort of decks like Merfolk and Hate Bears, things that might use Vials, or might use things like Spellskites. And it's just really good against even things like Storm, because it has a couple targets for Storm, including the biggest one is randoms of Pyromancer's Ascension, which is like how they get their engine online. And you've got Bolts for their other engine, which is Goblin Electromancer. Scavenging Ooze comes in after that. I personally don't use it in my Zoo because I view Zoo as to be more of an aggressive deck. But if you had 2 flex slots and you didn't want to do a Qasali Pridemage because you didn't have things like Twin in your meta, I would definitely see Scavenging Ooze. Scavenging Ooze is just good on its own. It gets bigger. It helps you against the mid-range decks that have Tarmogoyf and things like that. It also turns their spot removal into growth for your Scavenging Ooze. And it's an overall good card. I would say if you had to pick between 2 flex spots for a Hate Bear in your deck, I would choose Qasali Pridemage, but I would not blame you for having a Scavenging Ooze instead. Now, that being said, let's talk about some side cards. Choke, Mutagenic Growth, and Grafdigger's Cage. Mutagenic Growth I had in the main for a while, but I just sided it out against so many non-red decks that I kept it to the sideboard. I run in my current deck 2 Boros Charms in the main. To back it up, I also run 1 Mutagenic Growth as my flex spot in my sideboard. It comes in against any deck that runs red. So if it's Jund, it's going to come in to stop a Lightning Bolt. If it's Delver, it's going to come in so that it stops a Lightning Bolt. Or a Lightning Bolt plus whatever that other card is, the Lightning. I'm just blanking on it. It comes in against like decks like Twin, and it comes in against Twin because of Flame Slash, mostly. It comes in against American Control for things like Anger of the Gods. There have been times when I've been able to have a 2/3 Goyf out, and a 3/3, turn 1 put down a 3/3 Wild Noctil, turn 2 put out a 2/3 Goyf, and then have them Anger the Gods, and which would sweep my entire board away if I didn't Mutagenic Growth my Wild Noctil, turning my Wild Noctil into a 5/5 talent to turn so it survives Anger of the Gods. Then when the Mutagenic Growth hits the yard, it gives an instant boost to my Tarmogoyf. Tarmogoyf turns into a 3/4, and it's like that Anger of the Gods. They just tapped out, and I time walked them for free for 2 life, basically. And that's not bad because you're the aggressive deck. So Mutagenic Growth you can consider in the main, and it comes in against red decks is really what it comes in against. Other kinds of decks I wouldn't really side it in. It only if you're going against combo decks and you need to side out like to try to get more damage in as quick as possible, then I guess you could do Mutagenic Growth in as a free 2 extra damage. It's like a free shock at that point. But while talking about sort of combo decks and mid-rangey decks, Grafdigger's Cage is what you want to have against Pod. I currently have 3 of these in my sideboard. Yes, that means I'm not so great against Living End, which is a real deck, but currently unpopular. I would say Grafdigger's Cage is better because it still stops things like, for 1 mana, proactively stops things like, what do you call it? Stops things like weird Vengevine decks or recurrent decks like Esper Gifts, but has the upside of stopping Birthing Pod completely. The reason why I say that you want to do this is because Birthing Pod, without the pod, and if you are on pure race mode, you should be able to beat them. You should be faster than them, and they should be on their heels. Granted, they have 2 Kitchen Finks. They've got 2 Kitchen Finks. If they've got 1 Kitchen Finks and you're able to Rampage her over or Path to Exile, you should be able to win. That's all you need to win. Grafdigger's Cage stops them from dropping a pod. If they drop a pod and you do not have a Grafdigger's Cage out, your matchup stops going from favorable to becoming super unfavorable for you. Grafdigger's Cage is the most important card to have against pod right now, in my opinion. Now, that's not saying you shouldn't have Gork Clan Rampager, Chain to the Rocks, or Path to Exile. Gork Clan Path main, Chain to the Rocks as more removal on your side if you want it. I have about 2 Chain to the Rocks in my side. So that's what you got to use against pod. And it's still all right against stopping Grave stuff. It still is good against Storm. It's not bad. It's bad against Ad Nauseam. Ignore that. But it's still good against Storm, so it's still not the worst thing in the world you can use. Yes, you're in white, so you can use Rest in Peace, which could arguably be better for, I guess, the rest of the meta. But the one reason I suggest Grafdigger's Cage is because if you're using Knight of the Reliquary like I am, as well as Tarmogoyf, Grafdigger's Cage stops shenanigans while keeping your Tarmogoyf and your Knight of the Reliquary big. Now, Choke. I would say if you were going to pick any 2 cards out of these as the most important cards to look at, it's going to be Qasali Pridemage and Choke. There are so many blue decks on MTGO right now that you want to have Choke sideboard. I used to use Choke in Legacy, and it was amazing. It's just as good now. I remember back in the day when I was using it in Legacy, and I would just wreck any Brainstorm deck face because I had Choke in my sideboard. We are clearly back in those days. Delver's a strong deck. Storm is a strong deck, although I wouldn't side Choke in against Storm necessarily because they have such a low land count. But Twin, there's a game, and I think I have it recorded, so I'm going to put it into the meat space for you guys. But there's a game I played against Twin where I had land, 4 lands in hand, not done, land. I had 5 lands in hand, and a Gork Clan Rampager and a Choke. And I looked at that hand with 5 lands, no aggression whatsoever, and against my opponent's Twin deck, and decided he probably sided out his counter spells against me because he probably brought in removal. I have Choke. I am on the play. If I put Choke down, I will win the game. I drew a Qasali Pridemage, which was great, because I said he's going to, I can turn 2, put out that Qasali Pridemage, and he is going to either remand it, and I'll know he'll have counterspells, and he'll probably lose his counterspell, or he'll kill it, and then I'll go ahead and win. So that's exactly what happened. I put down turn 2 Qasali Pridemage, and then on his turn, he killed it with a Flame Slash, I believe, sorcery speed, leaving him with 1 mana open. The only thing he could have possibly done is Spell Pierce. I landed the Choke. There was like a minute of nothing on MTGO. The guy was just not doing anything. And then I got on the chat like an unhappy face. And then I put down the Gork Clan Rampager on turn 4. And I beat him to death with only the Gork Clan Rampager from then on out. The choke was enough that at any point in time, if he tapped out to put out his Deceiver Etch Arch, you would not be able to put on any twin effect on them, and he would just lose. And that's exactly what happened. He just couldn't do it. He just did not draw. He got to like 5 lands, all of them still untapped, but the mere threat of tapping them and losing his lands stopped him from being able to do anything. He couldn't even Cryptic Command me at that point. Choke is amazing versus Twin. I think we got that clear. It's great against Delver. There's no better feeling than putting a Choke out against a Merfolk deck or a Ninja Bear Delver, however stupid that deck is, and just laughing at it. You can side it in against control decks and watch the fact that they can't use Colonnade anymore. And yes, they can still cast a Bolt maybe, even Helix, and still untap with it. But the fact that they can't use Colonnade not because Colonnade doesn't untap, but because Colonnade can never be paid for, and then they don't have Cryptic Command to stall them out, you win. It's beautiful. If you ever land against a Choke against a blue player, and they're not Storm, you win the game. Choke is undoubtedly one of the best sideboard cards you can have. I would say 3 copies in your sideboard, at least, is mandatory currently in this meta. If you don't decide 3 copies is a bad number for you, you could do 2 copies, but I'd suggest doing 4 copies. It's that good of a card. Just Choke, literally you can drop it and win the game. Brian Kibler was not crazy when he had 3 Choke in his sideboard and 3 Blood Moon in his sideboard. And that was because Zoo is not a disruptive deck. And we do have a way to disrupt lands, and that's the way we do it. It's a way that we can use disruption aside from just burning. Now, in aggro Zoo, I wouldn't suggest having Blood Moons because you're going to screw yourself out of pumping your Wild Noctills, your Curd Apes, etc., etc. You don't have Mana Dorks either to cast things off of. So, Choke is all I would suggest. But Choke can win you the game just point blank out. Now, we're talking about Storm and things. Thalia and Ekkelon becomes really good to talk about. Both these creatures are not just good against Storm, they're also good against Control a little bit. Not amazing, but a little bit. Choke's better. They're still somewhat good against Control. I like maybe siding them in against Control, taking out Qasali Pridemage against American Control for them, because at worst, they're going to be removal bait, and they're still going to hit for 2 damage. I really like Ekkelon right now, because it's good against Storm, and it's good against Ad Nauseam, and it's good against any deck that dumps their hand. It's not great against Tempo. It's not good against it's all right against Tempo, but it's not really good against at all against aggro decks. Because aggro will either dump their hand before the Ekkelon of Great Revel comes in, or it's going to hurt you more. That being said, you can side it in against Delver, and it's still good. You can side it in against Control. I like siding it against Control personally, because anytime they counterspell something, anytime they use a Bolt, it hurts them, so that's great. Generally, they will aim the Bolt at Ekkelon right away, or Thalia right away, and it's either time walked them in Thalia's case, or it's actually done some damage to them in Ekkelon's case. Either way, it's pretty good. Rampager, I think, is mandatory in the main. I said this last time I did one of these quarterly updates. I already talked about just the meta in general. Rampager is like the best card you can have against mid-range. It's all right against Control. You never really want to be greedy, and this is here again a fair warning. If you are against an American Control deck or any kind of Control deck that has removal spells, they want you to use the Gore Clan Rampager. They want you to use it so that they can 2-for-1 you. Don't let them do it. Go to blocks, and they go, no blocks. Do not use the temptation unless you have to be like Gore Clan. Because then they'll go like, okay, now that you did that, I'm going to react to it and kill it. Go ahead and be like, okay, that's it for me. Passing priority. Guess what? You took the damage because you missed your chance to actually remove my creature. I have had too many online games to count where they know that I've got Gore Clan Rampager. Like, that's just a thing for the Sues. They know that I've got Gore Clan Rampager. And they will wait to bolt my Wild Noctill till after the Wild Noctill did some damage, because they thought that I would get greedy, and I did not. If they're tapped out, you can go for the Gore Clan. But its main use is against mid-range decks. It tramples over Finks and sort of negates its life gain. It tramples over Tarmogoyf and acts as removal. It tramples over things like Wall of Roots and makes it so that they aren't chump blocking anymore. It's definitely something that you really need to consider in main. Something else I don't have in here that you need to have 4 of main, even though I used to have 2 to 3 of in my main board, is Path to Exile. You need to have 4 Path to Exile main, and that's got everything to do with Pod. So that's the quick quarterly update. In the background, you're just seeing me play a random deck. It wasn't really anything impressive. It's just eye candy. If you have any questions specifically about Zoo or Zoo in the current meta, feel free to ask me in the comments below, or even better, go to MTG Salvation, go into Modern's format, and hit up the thread there in Established. I'll be able to answer that quickest. It's like on my priorities. As soon as like someone hits me up on there, I get back to it. So if you have any questions at all about there, and remember guys, to like the video, subscribe to it if you want to get more Zoo updates or just want to know more about the Zoo archetype, even if you don't play Zoo. And as always, make sure to feed the animals.